may speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. A story about a musician. After a couple of hours of listening to the beautiful melodies of the famed violinist Fritz Kessler, a woman was so moved by the experience that after the concert she rushed down to meet the musician and cried out, "I give my life to play as beautifully as you do." Kessler replied, "I did." What is the cost of fame and fortune? Sometimes we quickly jump to the conclusion that gifted people are simply more blessed than we are. We can forget that although gifted to a degree, true greatness comes with hard work and dedication and perseverance. We often can also sometimes forget that we all have our own giftedness, but to truly make use of our own gifts from God, again, we must sweat and toil and persevere. I mention this because today we continue this epic story of one of the most famous of all the biblical heroes, King David, a man who was described as the apple of God's eye and seemed to be blessed his whole life. And today we celebrate his coronation as king over all the tribes of Israel. You would be excused for thinking that this isn't really a big deal because it was preordained by God. And as we heard in the text, everyone seemed to really love him. We also know that he was anointed by God when he was only 15 to take on this role. So that it was only really a matter of time before this happened. But was it really? Hindsight and selective readings can sometimes blur the details of what happened in the meantime. There's a saying that you've probably heard that the devil is in the details, meaning that something might look simple at first glance, but it contains hidden problems that will bubble up later on. What's worth knowing about this phrase is we have to remember that God came first and then came the devil. And this phrase, the devil is in the detail, originated from a phrase earlier that said God is in the detail, expressing the idea that attention paid to small things has big rewards because details are important to God, and details speak about God. As we look into the scripture to try to find meaning and hope within the ancient text, it's good sometimes to go back and look at some of the details and to understand the whole picture. As I've said, unfortunately, we don't get to hear the whole story of King David on our Sunday mornings. There's just too much detail there. And so we tend to look at the big events. And if we quickly only look at these events as the lectionary has told us up until this point, we'll think that David does seem to have a really charmed life. He defeats Goliath, and then his rival Saul dies in battle. He dutifully mourns them, and he becomes the next king. It's kind of the story I told the children today. It's a really nice, neat picture, but there are details missing in it. And since we're all adults here, I thought we could go in and explore some of those details. David was blessed by God. But if we step back and look at the details of his life, we'll see that his life was no more charmed than ours was. In fact, he probably struggled harder. Was he gifted and blessed? Absolutely. Did he have hard times? Undoubtedly. And did he need every ounce of faith that he had to survive and to get to the position of king? You bet he did. David was blessed by God, but so are we. And sometimes in our own blessedness, we also get frustrated and we want to cry out, why is life so challenging and hard? Where are you, God? Why is everyone else life seemingly so much easier than ours? Comparison is the quickest way to unhappiness, but it's so easy to do. But today, if we compare our lives to David, perhaps we'll see how challenges, how struggles shaped him, and we can learn how they shape us as well. There were 15 years between when David was anointed by the prophet Samuel to be king to the time that he took on becoming king of Judah. It took an additional 7.5 years, of which time there was a civil war in the nation, before he was crowned for a third and final time of this story we heard today, becoming the king of all of Israel. That's 22.5 years from the time the promise was first made until it came into reality. 22.5 years is a long time, especially if you're actively waiting for something that you feel is promised to you and yet isn't happening. And in those 22 years, what did King David do before he became King David? Where did he go? Well, we know that he was for a while in the household of King Saul. He married his daughter. He became best friends with his son. He became a war hero. Everything was good. Except for things then became too good because Saul looked upon David and felt threatened by him. Sometimes when we were too successful, people don't like that and try to sabotage us. And that's what happened with David. He was doing so good that Saul felt incredibly threatened by him. So he chased him out of the kingdom. And David had to go and he lived in the desert. He lived in the wilderness. He had wilderness years. And in this time in the wilderness, David did and used the gifts that he'd been given. He was a gifted warrior. And so he collected around him other warriors, but all the good warriors really wanted to work for the king. So he collected around himself this ragtag group of mischiefs and outcasts and those who were on the run like he was from the king. And he created this group of basically paid mercenaries who would fight for anyone who could pay them. And he tried for a long time to use his skill to help his nation of Israel, even if it was kind of not in the proper channels. Now, this worked for a while. But all during this time, Saul kept trying to kill him. Saul makes 6 attempts on David's life. And throughout these 10 years and these 6 attempts on David's life, David has 3 really good opportunities where he could kill King Saul and take the crown at that point. But David doesn't, and there's a lesson here. Because David doesn't want to kill the one he believes is God's anointed. He knows that he's anointed by God, but he also recognizes that he is not the only one. Sometimes in our lives when we're going through troubles and hardships and we have other people who we feel are persecuting us or putting us down, it's easy. We might not have the opportunity to kill them or want to, and thanks be to God for that. But how many times have we wanted to put them down with our words? By slandering them or saying bad things about them. By forgetting that they too are anointed by God. That, yes, we may be children of God, blessed by God, but so are our enemies and so are all those who cause us pain and hardship. They are also God's beloved children. David was able to remember this, and so are we. After 10 years of running, David finally has had enough. It's too hard for him. He wants to give up. And so he takes him and this band of military that he's created, his own little mini army, and he goes over to the enemy lines. And he sells himself to one of Israel's enemies, the king of Gath, and says he will work for him. And he's able to do so for a while by kind of deceiving the king through what he's doing. But finally, David's time comes up. And the king of Gath, who has believed that David has been a loyal follower and servant of his, says he's going into war against Israel. And he wants David to join him. And he wants to be sure that David really will harm Israel, so he's asked him to be his own personal bodyguard in the fight, to stand right beside him in this fight against Israel. And David says, okay. And so David, at this point, is about to go and fight against his own home country, against his own people. There's something marvelous, though, that happens. For so much of David's time, he has been faithful to God. He has asked God's direction. He has bowed down to God. He has tried to do what he feels God has asked him to do. This time, he does not ask. But God was still merciful. He gets to the front lines of the battle. They're meeting just before, trying to plan strategy about how they're going to try to defeat Israel. David is there with the king of Gath, but so are all the Philistines. And they take a look at David and say, we know you, and we don't trust you. And they say, there is no way that you are fighting this fight with us. And they kick him out. So David is now rejected from his own country. He's rejected from all the countries around him. This is how they make their money. And so him and his tribe have to leave the fight, no longer employed, no longer welcomed anywhere, and they go home. And when they find out, when they get home, is that while they were away, their village was ransacked, it was burned to the ground. All the women and children and anything of value, all the livestock were stolen away from them. And at this point in time, David's own men start to turn on him, start to curse him, and start to demand his head. This is probably one of the lowest moments for David. And most and many people at this point would just give up. But not David. At this point in time, he remembers God. He remembers that there must be a plan, and he bows down and asks for advice and asks God what to do. And in a long story short, they chase after the bandits, they get everything back and more. And the blessing was that in the fight that he was supposed to fight in, that was the fight, the very same fight that Saul and Jonathan were killed. Because he was excluded from that, he now no longer has blood on his hands. He could truly proclaim his innocence and mourn them properly. And that is what he does. Sometimes we want something so badly and we can't see why God won't give it to us. But sometimes there's a blessing there. Sometimes God redirects our paths and brings us down to that lowest moment as a way to pay forth future blessings for us. With Saul and many of his sons dead, he is able to take on the crown of Judah. And 7.5 years later, when the final son of Saul passes away, not due to David, but due to his own men, he is able to take on the crownship of all of Israel. What did this take David to get there? Well, it took him his whole life, basically from the age of 15 to the age of 37 and a half. And this whole time, he was employed in trying to figure out a way there. It was promised to him, but it took him 22 and a half years to get there. David was faithful, but he did have moments of disobedience and sin, foolishness and shame. And yet, in this third and final time when he is anointed, we read in the scriptures that David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. For all his strengths, David was not a saint. Yet God was with him. Though it was a rough road from promise to fulfillment, and at times with utter isolation and disappointment, God was with him. and in our own lives that go up and down, and through our own moments of both faithfulness and disobedience, God is with us. We tend to believe sometimes that kings are born and not made. But David was never born a king. He was made a king, and it took patience, perseverance, respect, wisdom, and most of all, the grace of God. The details show of the pain and the struggle and the grace. The story as a whole tells of the victory. And this is the story of Christ too. As we sang today, we hear that God was named Emmanuel. God is with us at his birth. He was actually born a king. But as we heard from our gospel reading today, Jesus was rejected by those who knew him. He was mocked and belittled. Isn't this the son of Mary? And we know that he wound up going through so much greater struggle and pain before his final victory was ever acknowledged. This is also our story. And being immersed in our own story, sometimes we cannot see the victory through the details. We can't see the forest through the trees. But we need to remember to always look unto the bigger picture so that we can see the victory that awaits us. And that big picture is this simple phrase that God is with us. Jesus promises us after his resurrection that I am with you until the end of the age. David was anointed king, but we too have been anointed by God at our baptism. Today we may feel that there is something that God has promised to us, yet that promise seems very far away and difficult. But remember, in the midst of your waiting and the hardships, not to lose vision of God, not to lose sight of God's vision, and not to cease doing what is right. There are some things worth devoting our lives to, and God is one of them. The details in Scripture inform us that there is no promise that life, even a life lived in great faith, will be easy. But we are promised that if we stay the course and return to God after our mistakes, God will stay with us, and we will, in the end, be victorious. What will it take? Well, it might just take our entire lives, but at the end, we will be praised and honored. And as we journey to get there, let us remember, God is with us, and God can be found sometimes in the details.